From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
How does it look?
Expensive. You look very smart.
I hope so, because I'm extremely uncomfortable.
Can we see it with the hat?
All the chaps are wearing them in London. Only for informal evenings, of course. You both looked splendid.
You didn't look so bad yourself. If I ever wanted to attract a man, I'd steer clear of those clothes and that hat.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 26th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, Dressing the Abbey. Joining us to talk more about it are Jessica Bremer, Director of Communications at the Durham Museum in Omaha, and Tanushree Ghosh, an Associate Professor of English right here at UNO. Thank you both for being here and welcome.
Thank you for having us.
You bet. Jessica, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
For folks who haven't seen it, what is Downton Abbey?
Well, first of all, what are you waiting for if you haven't seen it? No. So Downton Abbey is one of the most popular dramas to ever air on TV. It ran for 6 seasons on PBS. Also, since then, there have been 2 major motion pictures about the series. So it follows the aristocratic Crawley family, some of which you saw there in those clips, who inhabit the fictional estate of Downton Abbey. And it follows their lives. It follows a lot of moments in history. The show starts out with the sinking of the Titanic. We see scenes from World War I, the dawn of the Jazz Age. So it really is this wonderful dramatic story all about the British aristocracy of the time. And it's one of the most popular shows that's ever aired on PBS.
Now, you mentioned it, but is Downton Abbey a real place?
Well, it is a real place, so it's not called Downton Abbey in real life. That was just for the show. It's called the Highclere Castle. You can see it there, and it is a real place. It has real owners. Many of these estates did not stay, which if you've watched the show, that's a big part of the storyline, is how is the family going to keep their estate and keep this line of this amazing place that they live in. So the fact that it still exists today and is still primarily used, for events and things, people can go tour it, but it's there if you want to go take a visit.
Wow, so who are some of the actors? We're going to put a photo up of someone that folks are going to recognize,
I have
I'm sure.
Feeling I know who it
but
is.
Talk a little bit about the cast, Jessica.
Well, yeah, so of course, Maggie Smith, I think everybody knows and loves. She's such a wonderful actress, and in this show in particular, she is one of the most wonderful characters. She's smart, she's witty, she's funny, but she really is sort of the matriarch of the family. Obviously, the fashion, when it comes to our exhibit, very much lots of Maggie's fashion is in the show. But Michelle Dockery is another name people might recognize. She plays Lady Mary. And there were also several guest appearances on the show. Shirley MacLaine had a role in the show. So there's some pretty big names that people will recognize. Even if you haven't seen the show, you'll know some of the characters.
Okay, so how would you sum up this series?
Well, I'd say it's a British drama that is really showing how the change in time affected the aristocracy and their servants of the period. The show is all about that. The male in the story, the very first episode, spoiler alert, dies in the sinking of the Titanic. And so they have 3 daughters, and how are they going to pass on this estate and their inheritance when the male of the family is no longer? So it's very much about society. It's very much about all the things that we know that went on in history during that time, following this family's life and how they're adjusting to it.
Okay, so speaking of history, while fictitious, right, there is a historical advisor. We're going to take a look at a clip.
Okay.
I'm Alistair Bruce on the set of Downton Abbey.
As the show's historical advisor, I'm here to help cast and crew create a world true to Britain's past.
Nannies used to put knives here. to make children sit up straight.
Every detail is critical, from what to wear to what to eat, from the elegant upstairs manners of the Crawley family.
I've sometimes said to Alistair, can I lean back just a little bit? Can I? And he says, absolutely not in front of your grandmother.
To the downstairs rules and rankings of the staff.
First footmen always take the lead. Look at him, he can't even balance it.
And I want you to rush to that door. Perfect.
Dr. Ghosh, thoughts as you watched that clip?
So interesting, but as I was watching it, I felt the need to sit up a little bit straighter. I think that shows like Downton Abbey are, you know, they can be best described as heritage productions. They create a particular time period, or recreate rather a particular, you know, time period. And social historians or historical advisors, they help the shows in recreating that particular time period with accuracy. So, you know, intangibles like speech or manners, even body language. You know, social historians can help the shows recreate that, capture that. That particular moment. But I always think about that balancing act that these shows have to maintain between being historically accurate and also sort of catering to the nostalgia that, you know, fuels the viewership of these shows. So I'm struck by how this clip is showing the life that goes on downstairs. But often, you know, what we see, the kind of the sumptuousness of the decor and the clothing and the vintage cars and all of that. We also don't see just the kind of more oppressive parts of the lives of the servants. The fact that their rooms are in the attic, or that they don't have running water, or that they're on call 24/7 and have to be this invisible workforce. Shows like this often, you know, Downton Abbey, to its credit, it does show us some of it, but often it also kind of obscures a little bit of it as well, in order to create that beautiful, sort of visually spectacular show that everyone will gravitate towards.
Well, we're going to delve into the history in just a few minutes, but before we do that, tell us a little bit about you.
Of course, I'm an associate professor of English at UNO. I teach and research in the 19th century and then contemporary literature, British and Anglophone. I work a lot with anti-colonial and post-colonial literatures and cultures, including film. I think I should mention, because of our discussion today, that I'm also very interested in how the past is recreated, how we reimagine it, how stories change as they travel through time and as they travel across places. So through even transnationally, as these stories travel, what happens to them? How do we reimagine them?
So I have to ask, how did you become interested in this area? Because history is something that, you know, strikes me, people can be very interested in it, but it seems like the older we get, the more interested we become in it. And so at what age were you? When did it just kind of hit you that I really want to go back in time and learn how we arrived at where we are?
I think my reasons were not as rational. They were more about I was a bookworm, and 19th century novels are the longest novels there are. So, you know, once you're done with books, you want the biggest book, 500-page minimum, and you're like, yeah, now I found a good book that'll go on forever. And just the storytelling is so unique. The characterization is just a mix of realism and melodrama, which I enjoy. And I think which Downton Abbey kind of really captures.
Okay. Well, I want you to take us back pre-1912, because Jessica had mentioned that the first episode was Titanic, right? So take us back before 1912 into your area of expertise and tell us what was going on in Britain at that time.
Sure. I think I'll combine sort of late Victorian and Edwardian periods in this, and I'll try to connect it to the show as well. I think one of the first things that we can talk about is the rise of the middle class in the 19th century and then again early 20th century as well. Following a lot of sort of voting reform acts, beginning with the Voting Reform Act of 1832, we see the middle class get representation, political representation. And we see a plethora of occupations open up that are not tied to the land, that require a portable skill set. So we see professions like lawyers, doctors, bankers, even clerks, which would be a little bit more lower middle class. We see these professions come up, and we see the rise of middle class as a social class. They also become culturally really significant. So one could say that by mid-19th century, we see the aristocracy, who still hold a lot of political and social clout, move to the margins a little bit, and the middle class come to occupy the socially central place. So in the show, we see Matthew Crawley and his mother. Matthew Crawley's a lawyer. His mother is a doctor's wife. She's a trained nurse herself. They come to Downton, and we see Downton through their eyes as well. We see them astonished at the lifestyle of the rich, of the of the aristocracy, and we see the kind of work ethic and integrity they bring to the show. That is kind of they articulate and express that particular kind of middle class sensibility. In terms of gender, one could say that we still see the continuation of social norms that are very Victorian. So the idea of middle and upper class femininity is still very much aligned with domesticity. So lower class women are working, they're working in factories and stores and as seamstresses. But middle and upper class women are still expected to marry. Their education is in line with that particular role in the home. They learn a little bit of history, geography, needlework, drawing, a little bit of music, everything that has to do with their function in the home as ornamental, as being good companions to their husbands, as keeping up maintaining the social networks of the family. But there is very little available to them in terms of education or profession outside of the home.
Okay, talk about the monarch in England at that time.
Sure. So at the time that Downton Abbey opens, which is, I believe, 1912.
Yes.
It's still considered Edwardian period, but the monarch is actually George V, who is Edward's son. Edward having passed in 1910, I believe. But Edward VII, he was a popular monarch. He reigned less than a decade, but he was a very popular monarch, and perhaps that's the reason why the period from 1901 to 1914 is termed the Edwardian era, because of the kinds of lifestyles that we see that came from the top, from Edward VII, who had a very colorful character, very different from his parents, very different from his mother, Queen Victoria. He was a much more colorful character. He was known as the Playboy Prince. He was also known as the uncle of Europe, because he was related to almost every aristocrat, every aristocratic family there was, every monarch, almost every, Germany, Spain, among others. And he was fluent in many, in several languages, particularly German and French. So he traveled across Europe, establishing diplomatic ties with many European countries. So he, all in all, he was a very successful monarch. He also believed in a lot of pomp and pageantry connected with the royalty. So Edwardian aristocracy sort of followed suit. Their lifestyles were also quite lavish. We would have, for instance, I think in the first season of Downton, we see we see the Crawley family host a hunting party. And these are weekend-long parties, except that the concept of weekend doesn't quite exist for a social class. That doesn't work. But these would be parties that would last a couple of days, and they would be, shooting and fishing, and then music and parlor games in the evening with banquets. So really luxurious, really elaborate celebrations that would go on. And then, of course, World War I happens, and things start to change quite a bit.
Okay, thank you. I did want to bring up, of course, Queen Elizabeth II's passing here recently after a 70-year reign. Talk to our viewers a little bit about the relationship there and Edward.
Of course, I believe that Edward VII was Queen Elizabeth's great-grandfather. So there's like Edward VII was followed by George V, his son, and then George V was succeeded by his son, Edward VIII, who abdicated, and then Elizabeth's father, George VI, took the throne, and then of course we have Elizabeth. The interesting bit of information is that George V, I believe, took on the family name of Windsor during the First World War because of anti-German sentiment. So we see a change in the name, the family name, that if we look back at the kind of lineage, we see that change.
Okay, thank you. So, big task for you here now. After all that you have said, transition us from the 19th century to the 20th century before we go back to Jessica to take a look at all of these fashions. So talk to us about that. Get us from one to the other.
Of course. It is a big task, and I think that it's also it's a contradictory time, because we see a lot of the value systems and ideologies of the Victorian era carry over into the Edwardian era, but by 1920s, as early as the 1920s, in fact, the term Victorian comes to signify stuffy attitudes and things that are outdated. And so we see the desire to kind of break with the old, whether it's in terms of fashion or morality or even literary innovation. We see a lot of changes. It was also a politically quite a turbulent time. We see the Liberal government propose what it termed a people's budget, which the Conservatives in the House of Lords protested against vociferously. There was almost a constitutional crisis when King Edward passed. But through all of that, conflict, we see the emergence of the welfare state. We see sort of safety nets that we now associate, we almost take for granted, things like pension for those who are over 70, a small payment for them, national insurance for workers who were unemployed or who had gotten into accidents. Measures like these were proposed and passed, but not without a lot of contention. The Irish Home Rule Bill was also going through. So it was proposed multiple times, and it passed in 1914. And it seemed like a civil war would be imminent in Ireland between those who supported the Union and those who wanted the Republicans who wanted Irish independence. The suffragettes were also sort of at work, and they were asking for really public attention towards the cause of female suffrage. And so you would have leaders like Emmeline Pankhurst, who led the suffragette protests and organized these protests, which took on quite a militant form in the early 20th century. So you would have activists chain themselves to railings and break windows. They would destroy golf courses, which I find particularly funny because of how they're bastions of sort of male leisure. And the intent of all of this was to draw attention to the really slow pace of change. And it never really had any kind of, the violence was never directed at any, or harmed any person. It was mostly sort of destruction of property or disruption. And they were very successful in getting public attention to it. We see a character on Downton Abbey, Lady Sybil, who is very sympathetic to the suffragette cause, and we see a conversation between the three sisters, the Crawley sisters, and their lady's maid, I think, Anna, who are talking about, well, do you want to be chained to a railing and force-fed, Semolina? And I believe the lady's maid says that she calls them brave women. So the show definitely does invoke the times and really talks about how the suffragette movement and how influential it was. You could not miss it. You could not ignore it.
I have to say, I believe she was the right guest to tie all of this together.
I just want to keep it
beautifully done. I could too. I want to get to these fashions. Thank you so much for bringing us into and then actually incorporating Downton Abbey into all of this. Jessica, before we look at clothes, tell us big picture, what is this exhibit?
So the exhibit is called Dressing the Abbey. It is quite literally the costumes, the original costumes from all 6 seasons of the series, as well as the first motion picture. So it ranges from 1912 to 1927. And you'll see pretty much every character that was been on the show represented somehow through the fashions of this exhibit. Not only is it the garments themselves, but the accessories, the jewelry, the hats. We've been able to actually take items from the museum collection and put them amongst the costumes, so to make them feel a little bit more realistic. We've actually built a faux facade of Highclere Castle, so people are really going to be transported back to Downton Abbey for sure.
So tell us what we're seeing here, Jessica.
Well, I tell you, seeing these on camera does not do them justice up close. They are absolutely gorgeous garments. Like I said, all of them are original. Now, some of them used in the show, this is a perfect example, was used with fabric from that time period, but not necessarily an original garment from that time period. So some of the dresses are original to the time period and they were all used in the show. Others were created by Cosprop in London for the show specifically. So, and the nice part is if you are a fan of the show, each label that goes along with each garment tells you which season of the show you can find it in. People will recognize that one because that's a Maggie Smith dress with her famous cane sitting there. I can just picture her saying, "What is a weekend?" You mentioned she jokes about that, like, "What is a weekend?" Because they don't have that concept. But they're beautiful. I think if you love the show, you will find one of your favorite characters here. And if you're not a fan of the show, these are beautiful garments that represent a really interesting period in history, and I think you'll find something to like.
So how was this exhibit made possible?
Yeah, so the exhibit was developed by a company called EDG. So there are companies that develop and travel these exhibitions. So they are bringing the show to us. We, of course, have local supporters that fund the exhibit to be able to bring it here for everyone. And then the costumes themselves are loaned from Cosprop, which is the company in London that developed all of the costumes for the show.
So Jessica, I have to ask, because just in our discussion prior to this recording, you were talking about the series. You're a fan.
I'm a huge fan.
So how is it to be the director of communications at the Durham Museum and be told this is coming?
Well, I have to say that when we decide on our exhibitions, you know, I do have to keep my personal opinions out of it, as hard as it is. And so I knew this exhibit was out there, but I didn't want my love of the show to influence that decision. But I think the great part about this show and the reason it fits at the Durham is because there is so much parallel and there is so much history in the show that as a history museum, we can use a show like Downton Abbey to teach people about these things that happened in our history, take them back to a period of time. So even though I am a super fan, I think the exhibit itself is a perfect fit for us, and I'm hoping fans of the show obviously are going to come, but I'm hoping others will just come and enjoy the costumes as well.
Wonderful. We're talking about dressing the Abbey today. I want to put up a graphic for our viewers for those wanting more information. You can go to Dressing the Abbey. DurhamMuseum.org, 402-444-5071. I want to thank Jessica and Dr. Ghosh for being here and sharing your time, expertise, history. Thank you so very much. Best wishes to you.
Thank you.
Thank our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course, all of you for watching. As we close, scenes from the newly renovated Jean Leahy Mall in downtown Omaha, as seen through the lens of Dayton and Sarah, a junior at UNO. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.